From a distance, Chatsworth House appears almost unreal. A long, low silhouette settled into the curve of the River Derwent, pale stone catching the light as if it were designed to be admired rather than questioned. Lawns stretch outward in deliberate calm. Trees seem to stand exactly where they were always meant to stand. Everything about the scene suggests balance, harmony, and ease. This is the version most people know. This is the version that appears on postcards, in period dramas, in coffee table books devoted to English beauty. But that serenity is a surface condition, carefully maintained. Behind the facade is something else entirely. Stand at the edge of the forecourt and let your eyes rest on the symmetry. It feels timeless, almost natural, as if the house simply grew out of the landscape. But houses like this do not grow. They are imposed. Every axis was chosen. Every view engineered. Every tree cut or spared with intent. Chatsworth House is not merely a home, it is the visible endpoint of centuries of accumulated authority. What you are seeing is power that learned how to look like grace. The earliest version of Chatsworth emerged in the mid-16th century, during a period when land was the primary currency of influence in England. Acres meant leverage. Rivers meant control of movement and trade. Proximity to the crown meant survival. The estate was positioned not for beauty alone, but for dominance within its region. From the beginning, this was a place designed to project stability in an unstable world. While monarchs rose and fell, the house endured, adapting its face while preserving its function. Power without a crown. Walk closer and the scale begins to register. The stone is not delicate. It is heavy, quarried, transported, and assembled at enormous cost. Thousands of tons moved without modern machinery. Hundreds of laborers whose names were never recorded. The serene facade hides the machinery of luxury. Logistics, labor systems, supply chains, and money flowing in steady, relentless streams. Nothing here was accidental, and nothing here was free. Step past the showpiece rooms and imagine the unseen hands that kept this place alive. Fires had to be fed day and night. Roofs repaired after every hard winter. Textiles replaced as fashions shifted. Entire teams of servants existed solely to ensure that the owners never encountered inconvenience. This was not comfort, it was infrastructure. Chatsworth functioned like a small, private state, complete with its own workforce, rules, and hierarchies. A house that became a machine. The calm you feel as a visitor is part of the design. Grandeur works best when it feels inevitable. When wealth looks effortless, its origins fade into abstraction. But behind the facade, power was exercised continuously. Local economies bent around the estate. Villages depended on it. Tenants answered to it. Decisions made inside these walls determined who ate, who worked, who stayed, and who left. This was authority expressed not through force, but through permanence. Through the quiet message that this house would still be standing long after individual lives had passed. There is a moral tension embedded in the stone itself. Beauty versus cost. Refinement versus extraction. To maintain an estate like Chatsworth required constant expenditure, and that money had to come from somewhere. Rents were collected. Resources were drawn inward. The bill comes due, even when it is hidden. Every polished surface rests on systems that were never meant to be seen by guests. What they don't show is as important as what they display. Pause in the great halls and listen, not for echoes, but for absence. Absence of noise, absence of labor, absence of the hundreds of people required to make this silence possible. The architecture absorbs effort and gives back tranquility. That exchange is the essence of aristocratic power. It turns human work into atmosphere. It transforms control into elegance. Over centuries, Chatsworth adapted to survive changing political climates. Taxes rose. Wars drained resources. Social attitudes shifted. Other estates collapsed under their own weight, sold off piece by piece, abandoned, or demolished. Chatsworth did not. Its survival required constant recalculation, strategic marriages, careful alliances, and an ongoing willingness to reshape its image without surrendering its core function. The house learned how to look harmless while remaining influential. A legacy with a price. Today, the estate is presented as heritage, as culture, as shared history. And in many ways, it is. But heritage can also be a soft focus lens, blurring the harder edges of how such places came to exist and why they endured. When you admire the gardens, you are also standing on evidence of power concentrated and preserved across generations. When you admire the view, you are looking through a frame designed to remind you, quietly, who controlled the land beneath your feet. This is the unease that lingers beneath the beauty. The sense that something vast and patient is at work. Chatsworth House does not threaten. It does not need to. Its power lies in continuity, in the way it normalizes inequality by wrapping it in stone, landscape, and tradition. A house that outlived crises by becoming indispensable to its own story. To understand why Chatsworth House stands exactly where it does, you have to strip away the romance and look at the ground itself. This valley was not chosen for poetry. It was chosen for leverage. Long before the present house rose from stone, this bend in the River Derwent offered something rare in Tudor England: control. Control of water, of movement, of fertile land, and of the routes that threaded northern England together. Location was strategy, and strategy was survival. Stand near the river and watch how it curves, slow and obedient, not prone to sudden flooding yet wide enough to command attention. In the 16th century, rivers were infrastructure. They powered mills, marked boundaries, fed livestock, and quietly governed trade. Building beside the Derwent meant access to water year-round and influence over those who depended on it downstream. This was not pastoral chance. It was calculated placement. A house anchored to a river could extract value without appearing aggressive. Power without spectacle. The surrounding land mattered just as much. Chatsworth sits at the threshold between lowland farmland and the rising gritstone edges of the Peak District. This boundary zone offered agricultural productivity below and natural defensibility above. Fields produced rents and food. Hills created separation. The estate was never exposed, yet never isolated. From here, land could be managed outward in every direction, consolidating ownership acre by acre. By the late 16th century, land ownership was the single most reliable engine of wealth in England, and this site allowed that engine to run efficiently. Step back and consider the political map of the time. The original house emerged in the 1550s, during a volatile period marked by religious upheaval, shifting royal favor, and the quiet redistribution of former monastic lands. Building here placed the estate within reach of London without being vulnerable to its chaos. It sat close enough to matter, far enough to endure. Northern estates that were too remote lost influence. Those too close to power were exposed when alliances shifted. Chatsworth occupied the middle ground. That balance was deliberate. The valley also offered something subtler: visibility without accessibility. From elevated points on the surrounding slopes, the house could be seen clearly, asserting presence across miles of countryside. Yet reaching it required time, permission, and effort. Roads narrowed. Approaches curved. Visitors arrived gradually, absorbing the scale before crossing the threshold. Architecture and geography worked together to choreograph arrival. This was landscape as theater, designed to impress before a single word was spoken. Behind the facade of natural beauty lay extensive modification. The land had to be drained, leveled, and reorganized. Streams were redirected. Marshy ground was stabilized. Stone was quarried locally, reducing transport costs while tying the house physically to its environment. Every logistical decision reinforced permanence. This was not a house meant to move, shrink, or disappear. It was planted like a claim driven into the earth. Look closer at the estate boundaries and another motive emerges: insulation from unrest. England's history is punctuated by uprisings, enclosure riots, and regional unrest driven by hunger and displacement. By situating the house amid extensive privately controlled land, the owners created distance between themselves and urban volatility. Tenant farms absorbed pressure. Villages buffered discontent. The house remained insulated, calm on the surface, while tensions dissipated outward. What they don't show is how space itself became a tool of social management. There was also the matter of symbolism. Great houses were statements, and statements required context. A mansion rising from cramped streets loses authority. One set within a broad, curated landscape appears inevitable. By placing Chatsworth in an open valley, the owners ensured that nothing competed with it visually or socially. The house became the reference point. Everything else oriented around it. Roads, farms, and later even tourism followed the gravitational pull of the estate. This is how architecture reshapes geography. The choice of site also anticipated longevity. Stone structures demand maintenance, and maintenance demands resources. The surrounding land generated steady income through rents, agriculture, and later mineral rights. The cost of keeping it alive was embedded into the land itself. Even during periods of national crisis, wars, economic contractions, rising taxes, the estate retained the means to repair roofs, pay staff, and project continuity. Many houses failed not because they were poorly built, but because they were poorly sited. Chatsworth avoided that fate. Step past the manicured lawns in your mind and imagine the estate as it functioned daily. Carriages arriving with goods. Livestock driven across fields. Timber hauled from managed woodland. Staff housed close enough to work efficiently, far enough to remain invisible. The location allowed this entire system to operate without drawing attention. The machinery of luxury worked best when hidden behind hedges, hills, and carefully designed distances. Even the orientation of the house reflects intent. Its principal facade addresses the valley, not the village. It looks outward, not inward. This was a message to peers, rivals, and visitors. Authority flows from this place. The house did not need to face the people who served it. It faced the land it controlled. That choice reveals more than any decorative flourish ever could. Over time, the site proved adaptable. As tastes changed, the house expanded, reoriented, and absorbed new architectural languages without abandoning its core advantages. The valley could accommodate growth. The river could be reshaped. The land could be reimagined. A poor site limits ambition. This one invited it. A house that became a machine because the ground beneath it allowed nothing else. The authority of Chatsworth House is not announced with banners or proclamations. It is embedded in proportion, scale, and control. The architecture does not ask for attention. It assumes it. From the moment the house was reimagined at the end of the 17th century, its design was engineered to communicate dominance without ever appearing defensive. This was not a fortress. It did not need walls or battlements. Its power lay in confidence. Stand in front of the west facade and let the symmetry settle in. The lines are disciplined. The repetition of windows is deliberate. Each bay reinforces the next, creating a rhythm that suggests order, inevitability, permanence. This was the era after Civil War, when English aristocracy had learned a hard lesson. Raw force invites challenge. Stability disarms it. Chatsworth's architecture signals that nothing here is temporary, and nothing here is contested. Power without a crown rendered in stone. The rebuilding of Chatsworth in the 1680s under William Cavendish, later the first Duke of Devonshire, coincided with a pivotal shift in English power structures. Parliamentary authority was rising. Absolutism was fading. The house reflects this transition. Instead of medieval mass and intimidation, it adopts the language of classical balance and controlled grandeur. The message is subtle but unmistakable. This family belongs at the center of the new order. The architecture aligns itself with modern governance rather than ancient violence. Look at the height of the principal rooms. Ceilings rise well beyond necessity, not for comfort but for hierarchy. Taller rooms elevate their occupants physically and psychologically. Visitors are made smaller by volume alone. Light enters from above, filtered through large sash windows that were expensive to manufacture and maintain. Glass on this scale was not decorative indulgence. It was an economic signal. Transparency itself became a luxury, paid for repeatedly as panes cracked, warped, or shattered in harsh winters. The bill comes due and the house absorbs it. Step past the showpiece rooms and notice how circulation is controlled. Grand staircases announce arrival. Secondary stairs disappear into walls. Hidden corridors run parallel to public spaces, allowing servants to move unseen. This separation is architectural discipline. It enforces social order without conversation or confrontation. Those who belong at the center move slowly, ceremonially. Those who serve move quickly, silently. The machinery of luxury depends on this choreography, and the architecture ensures it never breaks down. Even ornamentation carries authority. Decorative elements are restrained, not exuberant. Excess would suggest insecurity. Instead, Chatsworth favors repetition and refinement. Stone carvings are precise. Proportions follow rules derived from classical models associated with Rome and Renaissance power. These references were understood by contemporaries. To build this way was to declare education, taste, and legitimacy. The house speaks the language of those who govern, not those who merely possess wealth. Stand beneath the long enfilades of rooms and feel how perspective is used as a tool. Doors align perfectly, creating sight lines that extend across multiple chambers. This visual control is not accidental. It allows the owner to see through space, to command it with a glance. Guests move through these axes as if guided, subtly directed toward focal points chosen in advance. Architecture here does not simply enclose, it conducts behavior. Outside, the authority continues. The house does not retreat into its landscape, it dominates it through alignment and scale. Terraces extend outward, flattening terrain to accommodate geometry. Nature is edited. Trees are positioned to frame views rather than obstruct them. Water features are straightened, widened, or redirected to mirror architectural order. This is not harmony with nature. It is mastery over it. The landscape becomes an extension of the building's authority, reinforcing the idea that control radiates outward from the house itself. The cost of such control was immense. Stone had to be quarried and transported. Skilled masons were employed for decades. Roofs required lead, mined and shaped at significant expense. Interiors demanded imported materials, pigments and textiles sourced through long supply chains. Maintaining alignment, symmetry and finish over generations required constant intervention. Authority, once built, had to be continually funded. A house like this survives only if its owners can pay for its discipline year after year. Architecture also served as insurance. In a society where political favor could evaporate overnight, a house that embodied stability provided protection. Chatsworth's scale made it indispensable to its region. Its architecture implied continuity even during moments of crisis. Wars came and went. Governments changed. The house remained, projecting calm while absorbing shock. That resilience was not accidental. It was designed. Step into the great spaces and consider what is absent. There are no reminders of fear. No narrow passages for defense. No overt symbols of violence. Authority here is sanitized, refined, made palatable. That is precisely what makes it effective. Visitors are disarmed not by threat but by reassurance. The architecture tells them that this order has always existed and always will. Questioning it feels almost impolite. This is what they don't show when they talk about beauty alone. Architecture at Chatsworth is not merely aesthetic achievement. It is social engineering. It organizes people, resources, and time into a coherent system that privileges those at its center. The house became a machine, quietly converting land, labor, and capital into legitimacy. A legacy with a price. And yet, even now, centuries later, the authority still works. The proportions still command attention. The spaces still slow the body and steady the voice. You feel it before you understand it. That is the true measure of architectural power. It does not announce itself. It endures. The expansion of Chatsworth House was never driven by aesthetics alone. Stone followed influence. Wings were added not because space was lacking, but because power had arrived and needed a physical form. Every major enlargement of the house coincided with a political gain, a marriage secured, a title elevated, or a strategic loyalty rewarded. Architecture became a ledger, quietly recording alliances in masonry and scale. In the late 17th century, the Cavendish family's fortunes were bound tightly to the shifting balance of English politics. William Cavendish, a committed Whig, aligned himself with parliamentary authority at a moment when such allegiance was dangerous but potentially transformative. His support of the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was not abstract. It was personal, financial, and architectural. When William of Orange took the throne, Cavendish's loyalty was repaid with status, security, and access. Within a few years, he was elevated to Duke of Devonshire. The house responded accordingly. Stand back and consider the timing. The most dramatic rebuilding of Chatsworth began just as the Cavendish name was ascending into the highest ranks of British aristocracy. This was no coincidence. Titles demanded settings. A duke could not reside in a house designed for a gentleman. Expansion was a political necessity. The architecture had to signal arrival at the top tier of power, not just wealth but legitimacy. Stone walls widened to match social distance. Marriages played an equally decisive role. Strategic unions brought dowries, estates, and influence that flowed directly into the house. Each marriage strengthened the Cavendish network, connecting Chatsworth to other powerful families, parliamentary blocs, and economic interests. These alliances were not romantic abstractions. They translated into capital, offices, and protection. When new resources arrived, the house grew. New wings absorbed new authority. The building expanded as the family's reach extended outward. Behind the facade, this expansion required enormous logistical coordination. Enlarging a house of this scale meant mobilizing hundreds of craftsmen over decades. Master masons, carpenters, plasterers, glaziers, and laborers were hired, housed, and paid. Stone had to be quarried locally or transported at high cost. Timber was sourced, seasoned, and shaped. Lead for roofing and plumbing came from controlled supply chains. These were not one-time expenses. Maintenance followed immediately. The cost of keeping it alive rose with every political success. Political alliances also opened doors to materials and expertise otherwise inaccessible. Continental tastes entered Chatsworth through diplomatic channels. Architects and designers influenced by Dutch and Italian models were brought in, reflecting the Cavendish alignment with a modern, Protestant, outward-looking elite. The house absorbed these influences as proof of connection. Each imported idea was another signal that Chatsworth belonged to a wider, international power network, not merely a provincial estate. Step past the showpiece rooms and the evidence of expansion becomes clearer. Corridors lengthen. Service areas multiply. Entire new systems are added to support increased scale. Kitchens enlarged to feed more guests, staff quarters expanded to house growing numbers of servants, stables rebuilt to accommodate larger retinues. Political success meant more visitors, more obligations, more spectacle. The machinery of luxury had to scale up or fail. Chatsworth adapted because it could afford to. Alliances also insulated the estate from risk. In an era when fortunes were often lost through political miscalculation, the Cavendish network provided resilience. When taxes increased to fund wars, parliamentary allies mitigated the damage. When reforms threatened landholding structures, influence softened their impact. This protection allowed continued investment in the house even during periods when other estates stalled or collapsed. Expansion in this sense was a visible marker of survival. Look at how additions were positioned. New sections did not disrupt the core, they reinforced it. Expansion was conservative, respecting established axes and proportions. This was a deliberate architectural choice. The message was continuity, not rupture. Political alliances had elevated the family, but they presented that elevation as natural progression. The house appears to have always been destined to grow. That illusion is powerful. It disguises contingency as inevitability. Behind the scenes, these alliances demanded constant upkeep. Hosting political figures required lavish hospitality. Rooms were furnished and refurnished to meet expectations. Entire floors might be prepared for a single visit. Food supplies increased. Staff numbers rose. The unseen hands multiplied. Every alliance carried ongoing costs, and the house absorbed them as part of its function. Chatsworth was no longer just a residence. It was an operational hub for influence. There is a moral tension embedded in this growth. Expansion signaled success, but it also deepened dependency on systems that extracted value from land and labor. Rents had to rise. Resources were drawn inward. Villages adjusted to the needs of the estate. The bill comes due somewhere, even if it never appears on the balance sheets displayed to guests. What they don't show are the human adjustments required to sustain architectural ambition. Yet the expansion worked. By the early 18th century, Chatsworth stood not just as a house but as evidence. Evidence that political alignment could be translated into permanence. That loyalty could be built into stone. That power, once secured, could be made to look serene. A house that became a machine precisely because it was fed by alliances rather than force. Stand in the expanded wings and feel how space accumulates authority. Each addition speaks softly but insistently. This family was here and here and here again at every turning point that mattered. Architecture does not argue. It records. And what Chatsworth records is a history of power gained through alignment, preserved through expansion, and normalized through beauty. The intimidation exerted by Chatsworth House was never crude or openly violent. It did not need to be. Its power lay in atmosphere, scale, and inevitability. From the moment the house dominated the valley, it announced a simple truth to anyone approaching. This place was not negotiable. It was not temporary. It was not equal. Long before a word was spoken, the architecture had already decided the outcome of the encounter. Stand on the approach road and feel the imbalance. The house grows as you near it, not suddenly but steadily, absorbing the horizon. This was intentional. Distance was used as a psychological instrument. Rivals arrived already diminished, having spent miles traveling through land that visibly belonged to the estate. Fields were leased. Woodlands were managed. Villages existed within the orbit of the house. By the time a visitor reached the forecourt, resistance had softened into deference. The landscape itself had done the work. For political rivals, Chatsworth was a reminder of scale. In an age when power was measured in acres, rents, and retainers, the house made its resources unmistakable. The number of windows alone communicated wealth, each pane taxed, maintained, and replaced without hesitation. Stables housed horses not for necessity but for display. Kitchens were sized for hosting dozens, sometimes hundreds, of guests at once. This was abundance rendered visible. Any rival standing within those walls understood that they were dealing with a family whose influence could not be matched easily or quietly. Inside, intimidation took a more refined form. Rooms were designed to control pace and posture. Ceilings lifted the gaze upward. Long galleries forced slow movement, encouraging silence. Visitors waited. They were kept standing. They were ushered through sequences of spaces that reminded them, again and again, that they were guests within a system that did not need them. This was power without a crown, enacted through architecture rather than decree. Step past the showpiece rooms and consider what common people encountered. For tenants, Chatsworth was not a destination but a presence. It loomed over their economic lives. Rents were set in offices they would never enter. Leases were renewed or revoked without negotiation. A bad harvest did not stop obligations. The house endured while others adjusted around it. The intimidation here was structural. The estate controlled access to land, employment, and shelter. Dependence was built into the system. The sheer size of the household reinforced this hierarchy daily. Dozens of servants moved through hidden corridors unseen by guests, yet constantly visible to local communities who supplied labor and goods. The message was clear: the house employed, sustained, and replaced people at will. If one worker failed, another would take their place. The machinery of luxury required constant human input, and that expendability was understood beyond the walls. Fear did not need to be spoken. It was implied. Even justice felt distant. Disputes involving the estate rarely favored those beneath it. Legal challenges required resources few possessed. Influence flowed quietly through local institutions, shaping outcomes before they were ever formalized. For common people, Chatsworth represented an authority that could not be appealed. Its intimidation lay in its permanence. You could argue with a person. You could not argue with a house that had stood for generations and showed no sign of yielding. Rivals within the aristocracy felt a different pressure. To be invited to Chatsworth was an honor. To be excluded was a statement. Hospitality itself became a weapon. Lavish gatherings demonstrated capacity. Silence signaled disapproval. The house could elevate reputations or quietly suffocate them. Political conversations held within its walls carried weight precisely because of where they occurred. Decisions made here felt final, anchored by stone and history. Architecture reinforced this dominance through control of visibility. From certain rooms, owners could observe arrivals without being seen. Balconies, elevated windows, and carefully aligned sightlines allowed surveillance disguised as elegance. Those entering were always aware of being watched even if they could not see who watched them. This imbalance fostered caution. Words were chosen carefully. Promises were measured. The house shaped behavior by making privacy a privilege rather than a right. Outside, the gardens extended the intimidation in subtler ways. Paths guided movement. Open lawns offered no cover. Visitors crossed exposed spaces before reaching shelter, visible from the house at all times. Nature was disciplined to serve authority. There were no wild corners near the core, no places to hide. The estate projected order outward, reminding everyone within view that chaos had been pushed to the margins. What they don't show in heritage narratives is how this intimidation normalized itself. Children grew up knowing the house as a fact of life. Workers measured time by its routines. The sound of bells, the arrival of carriages, the rhythms of service shaped daily existence. Over time, the house ceased to feel oppressive because it ceased to feel optional. That is the deepest form of control, when dominance becomes background. The cost of maintaining this aura was immense, but it was considered necessary. Repairs were constant. Staff wages consumed vast sums. Entertaining rivals required excess. Yet the bill comes due only if authority falters, and Chatsworth was built to prevent that. Intimidation was not an accident of scale, it was a strategy of survival. A house that became a machine precisely because fear, once embedded, required less effort to sustain. Stand in the great spaces and feel the weight of expectation. You are not threatened. You are reminded. Reminded of who belongs, who decides, and who adapts. That reminder worked on dukes and laborers alike. It did not discriminate. It simply endured. Inside Chatsworth House, power does not announce itself openly. It whispers. It hides in alignment, placement, omission, and repetition. What appears decorative at first glance often functions as code. This is not symbolism meant for the public. It was designed for those who knew how to read it. Behind the facade, authority is embedded into the building's bones. Stand in the great rooms and notice where your eye is guided. Ceilings draw attention upward but not toward heaven. Toward lineage. Coats of arms appear not as isolated emblems, but as a system, repeated across ceilings, fireplaces, and thresholds. These symbols were not mere family pride. They were legal statements, reminders of land rights, marriages, and titles secured over centuries. Each shield quietly declared ownership, continuity, and legitimacy. A visual ledger of power without a crown. Step closer to the fireplaces and you begin to see how symbolism merges with function. Fireplaces were the heart of each major room, both practically and socially. Above them, carvings and reliefs often depict classical figures associated with rule, order, and endurance. Roman emperors, mythological lawgivers, and allegorical figures of wisdom and stability appear again and again. These were deliberate choices. Rome was not referenced for beauty but for authority. To associate the family with Roman ideals was to align them with governance itself. Hidden corridors offer another layer of meaning. They are not simply practical solutions for servant movement. Their very existence reinforces hierarchy. The house is split into visible and invisible worlds, each governed by different rules. Those allowed to remain unseen hold power of a different kind, control of timing, access, and information. Messages traveled through these passages faster than footsteps in public rooms. Decisions moved quietly. The architecture ensured that authority could act without being observed. What they don't show is how silence itself becomes an instrument. Look at the staircases. There is never just one. Grand staircases are wide, shallow, and ceremonial, designed to slow ascent and encourage display. Secondary stairs are narrow, steep, and concealed, built for speed and obedience. The contrast is intentional. Movement itself becomes symbolic. Who climbs slowly, who climbs quickly, who is seen, and who disappears. These distinctions are enforced by stone, not instruction. The house teaches behavior without speaking. Even the placement of doors carries meaning. Major rooms align in long sequences, allowing views through multiple thresholds at once. This was not aesthetic indulgence. It was spatial dominance. Standing at one end of an enfilade, the owner could command an entire axis of space with a single glance. Guests moving through these rooms were constantly framed, observed, and anticipated. The architecture created a subtle imbalance of awareness. One side always knew more than the other. Stand beneath the painted ceilings and the symbolism grows heavier. Many depict ordered worlds, heavens aligned, seasons in balance, figures arranged in harmony. Chaos is absent. Conflict is resolved. These images were not escapism. They were aspiration made permanent. At a time when political instability was common, the house presented itself as a counterargument. A place where order prevailed. A visual claim that this family belonged among those who stabilized the nation rather than threatened it. The materials themselves carry hidden messages. Stone is used where wood would suffice. Marble appears where local materials could have done the job. These choices were expensive, slow, and difficult to maintain. That was the point. To afford inefficiency was to demonstrate surplus. The cost of keeping it alive became part of the message. Anyone who understood construction knew what these materials required in labor and upkeep. The building signaled that resources would not run out. Even absence is symbolic. There are few depictions of labor. Servants appear rarely, and when they do, it is in idealized or allegorical form. The unseen hands that sustain the house are deliberately erased from its visual narrative. This omission reinforces hierarchy by making work invisible. Luxury appears self-generating. The machinery of luxury hums quietly behind walls, while surfaces suggest effortlessness. The bill comes due elsewhere. Gardens, too, contain coded authority. Paths align with windows. Statues are placed where they can be observed from key interior rooms. The landscape responds to the house, not the other way around. This visual submission of nature mirrors social submission. Order radiates outward from the center. Visitors walking the grounds remain subtly aware that they are always within view, always framed by the architecture. Surveillance disguised as beauty. Stand still and listen. The acoustics of major rooms were designed to carry voices clearly from specific positions. The head of the table could be heard without raising their voice. Others could not. Sound becomes another hierarchy, shaping conversation and reinforcing authority. These are not accidents of design. They are choices layered over generations, refined as the house learned how to govern space more effectively. Even the private apartments contain symbols meant for limited audiences. Intimate rooms display genealogies, portraits arranged by rank rather than affection, and objects acquired through political favor. These spaces were not for display to the masses. They were reminders to the family itself. A constant visual reinforcement of obligation, expectation, and inherited responsibility. Power here is not celebratory. It is disciplinary. What emerges is a house that communicates on multiple levels at once. To the casual visitor it offers beauty. To the informed peer it offers warning. To those who lived and worked within its orbit, it offered instruction. Every symbol, visible or hidden, contributed to a single message. This order is established, defended, and continuous. Questioning it requires more than courage. It requires resources. Behind the facade, Chatsworth House functions as a text written in stone, paint, and space. It does not shout its authority because it does not need to. The symbols have been doing their work for centuries, shaping behavior long after their creators are gone. This is how architecture outlives politics. A legacy with a price. The long-term influence of Chatsworth House did not depend on any single duke, generation, or political moment. Its power lay in repetition, in continuity. Over centuries, the house became a reference point for what aristocratic authority should look like, how it should behave, and how it should endure. Other families rose and fell, but Chatsworth remained, quietly shaping expectations across the British elite. From the 18th century onward, Chatsworth functioned as a benchmark. Its scale set standards. Its organization modeled how great estates should operate. Aristocratic families across Britain looked to it, sometimes consciously, sometimes instinctively, when expanding their own houses, arranging their households, or presenting themselves in political society. This was influence without instruction. The house did not teach. It demonstrated. Stand in the great halls and consider how often Chatsworth hosted the people who mattered. Politicians, ministers, monarchs, and power brokers passed through these rooms not as conquerors, but as guests. Decisions discussed here traveled outward into Parliament, court, and country estates. Over time, the house gained a reputation not just as a residence, but as neutral ground for elite consensus. To be received at Chatsworth was to be recognized as legitimate. To be excluded was to feel the edges of power closing in. This influence extended into marriage patterns. The Cavendish family's position made them desirable allies. Their unions linked Chatsworth to other major houses, weaving a dense network of shared interests. These alliances stabilized aristocratic power at a time when social mobility threatened old hierarchies. The house became a node in a national system of inheritance, landholding, and political coordination. Its influence spread not through conquest but through connection. Architecture amplified this reach. The disciplined classicism of Chatsworth shaped taste across Britain. Other estates adopted similar proportions, layouts, and spatial hierarchies, signaling alignment with the same values: order, permanence, restraint. In this way, Chatsworth helped normalize a particular aesthetic of authority. Aristocratic power became visually coherent across regions, reinforcing the idea that it was unified, natural, and self-regulating. Behind the facade, this coherence had consequences. When aristocracy speaks in a single architectural language, dissent becomes harder to express. Difference looks like deviation. Over time, the influence of Chatsworth contributed to a narrowing of acceptable forms of elite behavior. Grandeur was acceptable. Excessive display was not. Stability was prized. Sudden ambition was suspect. The house helped define the rules of the game by embodying them so completely. The estate also influenced how aristocrats managed decline. As economic pressures mounted in the 19th and early 20th centuries, industrialization, taxation, war, many houses collapsed under their own weight. Chatsworth did not. Its survival strategy became a model. Portions of the house were opened selectively. Land was reorganized. Operations were professionalized. The aristocracy learned that survival required adaptation without surrender. Chatsworth showed how to appear unchanged while quietly transforming behind the scenes. Step past the showpiece rooms in your mind and think about labor. Chatsworth employed armies of staff long after similar houses had dismissed theirs. This continuity preserved a way of life that others could no longer afford. It reinforced the idea that true aristocracy was measured not by survival alone, but by the ability to maintain old forms. Other families, watching closely, adjusted their ambitions accordingly. The cost of keeping it alive became a standard against which commitment to tradition was measured. Politically, the house exerted a stabilizing influence. Members of the Cavendish family occupied key roles in government over generations. Their approach favored moderation, institutional continuity, and gradual reform. This philosophy mirrored the house itself. Not radical, not static, enduring. Over time, this alignment between architectural presence and political posture reinforced the perception that aristocratic leadership was synonymous with national stability. Even critics were shaped by this influence. Reformers often framed their arguments in response to houses like Chatsworth, using them as symbols of entrenched privilege. In doing so, they acknowledged its centrality. You do not argue against irrelevance. The house became a focal point in debates about land, labor, and inheritance precisely because it had endured so visibly. Its influence extended even to those who opposed the system it represented. Culturally, Chatsworth helped define how aristocracy should be remembered. Art collections, curated interiors, and controlled public access shaped narratives of refinement and stewardship. Over time, the house positioned itself as custodian rather than exploiter, reframing power as responsibility. Other estates followed this model, leaning into heritage as a shield against scrutiny. What they don't show is how carefully that narrative was constructed, and how deeply it influenced public perception. The ripple effects reached beyond architecture and politics into identity itself. To belong to the British aristocracy came to mean aligning with certain values embodied by houses like Chatsworth. Discretion, continuity, control. Loud ambition faded. Quiet endurance prevailed. This cultural shift allowed old families to persist longer than expected in a rapidly changing world. The house became proof that adaptation did not require surrender of status, only refinement of strategy. Behind the facade, the influence was not always benign. The normalization of aristocratic permanence made inequality feel timeless. When power lasts long enough, it begins to look inevitable. Chatsworth's survival contributed to this illusion. Generations grew up knowing the house as a fact of life, its dominance unquestioned. The unseen hands that sustained it disappeared into abstraction. The machinery of luxury became heritage. Yet influence cuts both ways. By remaining visible, Chatsworth also carried the burden of scrutiny. Its size invited questions. Its endurance provoked curiosity. In the modern era, the house stands as both symbol and test case. Can such power justify itself indefinitely? Can legacy outweigh cost? These questions echo precisely because the house shaped the system so thoroughly. As you consider its long shadow across British aristocracy, one truth becomes clear. Chatsworth did not merely reflect power. It trained it. It taught generations how to hold authority quietly, how to adapt without appearing to change, and how to survive when others failed. A house that became a machine not through force but through example. In the end, Chatsworth House does not need explanation. It stands as evidence. Stone does not argue and it does not apologize. It endures. What began as a strategic position became a system, and what became a system hardened into permanence. This is power frozen in stone, not because it stopped moving but because it learned how to hold its shape while everything else shifted around it. Stand in the hall and feel the temperature change. Thick walls, moderate heat and sound, separating interior calm from exterior uncertainty. That insulation is physical, but it is also social. For centuries, the house absorbed shocks that destabilized the world beyond its gates. Civil wars, revolutions, tax reforms, industrial upheaval, 2 world wars. Each time the exterior landscape changed. Each time the house remained. Survival on this scale is never accidental. It is designed, funded, defended, and constantly recalibrated. The stone you see is the final form of countless decisions. Decisions about land, labor, alliances, aesthetics, and timing. Decisions about who mattered and who adjusted. Behind the facade lies a record of calculated restraint. Chatsworth never chased novelty for its own sake. It avoided extremes. It favored balance, repetition, and continuity. Those qualities read as taste. They function as strategy. When power lasts long enough, it begins to resemble good judgment. Step past the showpiece rooms in your mind and picture the unseen infrastructure that allowed this endurance. Roofs reletted every generation. Foundations monitored and reinforced. Drainage systems maintained to protect stone from rot and frost. Armies of staff, paid even in lean years because losing expertise would cost more in the long run. This is the cost of keeping it alive. It is not romantic. It is relentless. The house survives because it is treated as an organism that requires constant care. What they don't show is how close such places come to failure. Estates like this have teetered on collapse repeatedly. Agricultural downturns reduced rents. New taxes punished landholding wealth. Deaths without heirs threatened fragmentation. Wars diverted resources and attention. Each crisis forced choices. Sell land or sell art. Close rooms or reduce staff. Open the house or retreat from public view. Chatsworth's genius lies not in avoiding these moments, but in navigating them without losing identity. Change occurred quietly behind the facade. Over time, the house itself became an argument. An argument that aristocratic power was stable, responsible, and essential. That continuity equaled legitimacy. That preservation was a form of stewardship rather than control. These ideas were not spoken aloud. They were demonstrated daily by the simple fact of the house's existence. When something survives long enough, it stops being questioned. It becomes background. That is perhaps the most effective form of authority. Look at the stonework closely and you see repairs layered over centuries. Blocks replaced. Joints repointed. Surfaces cleaned then cleaned again. The house is not frozen because it never changed. It is frozen because change was absorbed so thoroughly that it disappeared into the whole. This is how power learns to hide its labor. The machinery of luxury hums beneath a surface that appears effortless. The moral tension remains unresolved. Beauty and cost are inseparable here. Every serene view is supported by extraction, organization, and discipline. Land that could not be worked freely. Labor that was directed rather than chosen. Wealth that flowed inward and stayed there. These facts do not negate the achievement. They complicate it. They remind us that elegance is rarely neutral. It is usually paid for, often by people whose names do not survive in stone. Yet to reduce Chatsworth to exploitation alone would be too simple. The house also preserved skills, landscapes, and knowledge that might otherwise have vanished. It adapted when adaptation was difficult. It absorbed public scrutiny and reframed itself as heritage rather than fortress. It learned to open its doors just enough to remain relevant without surrendering control. These contradictions are the substance of its power. Endurance is never pure. It is negotiated. Stand outside once more and look at the full silhouette. It feels settled, almost immovable. But that stillness is deceptive. It is the stillness of something that has already won its battles. The house does not need to expand, intimidate, or announce itself anymore. Its authority is assumed. Its presence alone suggests that whatever systems built it are still, somehow, intact. That suggestion carries weight long after the original context has faded. This is what power looks like when it outlives ideology. When it survives not by force but by becoming familiar. When stone, landscape, and tradition fuse into something that feels inevitable. Chatsworth House does not dominate the modern world, but it haunts it. It stands as proof that certain structures, once established, can persist far beyond the moment that justified them. As the light moves across its facade and shadows settle into grooves carved centuries ago, one question refuses to erode. Not about architecture alone but about systems, inheritance, and memory. Who really paid for this? And which house should we investigate next?